Welcome to The Explainer. So, how on earth does a private company end up running an entire subcontinent? It's a huge question, right? Well, today we're going to dig into the very architecture of that control. We're talking about the administrative and judicial systems the British built to rule India. Systems that, believe it or not, have left a mark that's still visible today.
All right, so let's get right into it. This whole thing wasn't an overnight takeover. It was a gradual shift, from a bunch of merchants just looking to make a profit to becoming the masters of a massive empire. And the secret to their success? It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about the slow, careful, and deliberate construction of a system built for one thing: total control.
Yeah, like I said, this wasn't some quick conquest. It was a slow burn, a process that unfolded over 250 years. It's a journey that really moved in stages, from trade to grabbing power, and finally to full-blown empire. Let's break down exactly how that happened.
So it all starts with the East India Company, right? For the first century and a half, they were pretty much just focused on business, on trade. But then came 1757 and the Battle of Plassey. That was the game changer. That single victory kicked off 100 years of aggressive expansion, and that intense period led straight into the final phase, direct rule by the British Crown itself. The big turning point? The Indian Rebellion of 1857. That event was the catalyst for massive change. After it was suppressed, the British government basically said, "Okay, company, you're done." They dissolved the East India Company and took over completely. This is the official start of what we call the British Raj, and it was a much more formal, much more structured system led by a viceroy who was basically the Queen's CEO in India. So you've got to be thinking, how did they pull this off? How did a handful of British officials actually manage this enormous, incredibly diverse territory? Well, they built something they nicknamed the steel frame of the Raj, and it was exactly what it sounds like: a powerful, rigid administrative machine. And the engine at the very heart of this machine was the Indian Civil Service, the ICS. Think of it as this super elite group of officers. These guys were trained to see themselves as these brilliant philosopher guardians. There weren't many of them, but the power they held was just immense. They were the ones on the ground running everything from collecting taxes to enforcing the law in these huge districts. The whole system was really built on four main pillars, and every single one was designed for top-down control. You had centralized control, right? The big decisions were all made back in London and then carried out by the viceroy. You had the powerful bureaucracy. That's the ICS we just talked about, acting as the government's engine. Then, of course, the military was always there, ready to enforce British rule. And finally, all of that power got funneled down to the local level, where you'd have one single guy, the district collector, who was basically the face and the fist of the entire Raj in his area. But running the government is only half the battle. If you really want to cement your authority, you've got to control the law. So that's what the British did next. They started building a whole new legal framework from scratch, designed to impose their legal principles all across India. And this legal takeover didn't happen all at once. It was a step-by-step process. First up, they set up a Supreme Court in Calcutta. Then, a few decades later, they built a whole network of high courts in the other big cities: Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. This new system just swept away all the old courts that the East India Company had been using. What you ended up with was this new legal pyramid, with separate courts for civil and criminal cases, and you can bet British judges were sitting right at the very top.
But maybe the most powerful piece of this entire legal puzzle wasn't a building or a court, it was a book. Because in 1860, the British rolled out a single comprehensive legal code that was going to define what a crime was and what the punishment would be for everyone in India for a long, long time.
Yeah, 1860. That's the year. The year a single law was put in place with an incredibly ambitious goal: to bring this huge, unbelievably diverse subcontinent under one single, uniform system of criminal justice.
And that law was the Indian Penal Code, the IPC. It was mainly drafted by this guy, Lord Macaulay, and it was a truly monumental piece of work. The whole point was to create one single, standardized criminal code for everyone. It defined everything, from simple theft all the way up to murder, and it spelled out the punishments. This one book was meant to replace the messy patchwork of local and religious laws that existed before.
Now, on paper, the goal was neutrality. The idea was to have one set of laws that applied to everybody equally, whether you were a powerful prince or a poor farmer. And that sounds great, right? But you have to remember, this was also a classic colonial move.
Using the idea of uniformity is an incredibly powerful tool for control.
And this is where the story gets really wild. Think about its legacy. The British Empire? It's gone. But the Indian Penal Code? It's still here. With some changes, of course, but it remains the absolute foundation of criminal law in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh today. It literally outlasted the empire that created it. That's incredible.
So, when we step back and look at the whole picture, what is the legacy of this steel frame they built? Well, it's not simple. It's incredibly complicated, and honestly, people are still debating its impact right now.
It really is like looking at two sides of the same coin. On one side, you can argue these systems brought in some elements of modern government, like a centralized administration and a standard legal system. But then you flip the coin and you see that every single one of those reforms, every single new rule, was designed with one ultimate goal: to protect and expand British power.
And that's the crucial takeaway here. Yes, these structures created a kind of stability and order, but their fundamental purpose, the reason they were built in the first place, created deep, deep inequities. The local population had almost no say in how they were governed, and the systems themselves were often exclusionary, they were often unjust, simply because they were never built for the people being ruled. They were built for the rulers.
Which, of course, leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. It's a question that really echoes through history, not just here, but everywhere. When a system is built from the ground up for control, can it ever truly deliver justice for everyone?